You're listening to Indications by the Conference Board.
Hello, my name is Ilaria Maselli, Senior Economist at the Conference Board, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Indications podcast, a series brought to you by the Conference Board. Today, I will be sitting down with Executive Director Chuck Mitchell to discuss the first results of the C-Suite Challenge survey. Every year, since 1999, we ask CEOs across the globe to identify the most critical issues they face and their strategies to meet them. Since 2017, we've expanded the survey pool beyond CEOs to the entire C-suite. This year's survey was conducted between September and October in collaboration with 14 partners around the world. 1,500 C-suite executives replied, including 740 CEOs. We start the survey with two questions. What are your top concerns inside your organization and in relation to the external environment? The replies to these two questions is what we are going to discuss today. Good morning, Chuck, and welcome. Let's start with the high-level findings. What are the top concerns related to the outside world for CEOs in 2020? Tell us.
Right. Thanks, Ilaria. Yes, indeed. For this year, the recession risk comes out as the top external concern for CEOs. And that's kind of an interesting notion. It was number one last year, but 2 years ago, it wasn't even on their radar. So we're seeing this rise in concern over recession risk. And it's really kind of amplified by all this uncertainty around the global trade, the notion of more intense competition, global political instability. I mean, I think you see issues arising from Hong Kong to Latin America to even in the UK with Brexit and the election. So, and this notion about tight labor markets, right? There's a big concern across the board about tightening labor markets, actually being able to find that talent, and that's interesting because it relates to their internal concerns too. But those five are really the key issues that are keeping CEOs up at night in 2020. At least that's what they tell us.
All right. And this concern related to the recession, I mean, the fact that it comes up again as number one risk, do you think is justified or not?
This is an interesting proposition because this concern about recession risk really kind of goes contrary to the numbers, if you will. Our forecast, the Conference Board's forecast for 2020 is global growth to be at around 2.5%. So it's a little bit of an uptick from last year. So this concern about recession risk, the danger here is that CEOs are creating a narrative in their own mind that could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it's more than, and we're starting to see signs that this is actually starting to happen. So, one of the concerns, the internal concerns for CEOs in this year's survey is the notion of cost reduction or baseline cost reduction. So they're starting to put these actions into play against their fears. We see that the Atlanta Federal Reserve here in the U.S. actually in the first half of 2019 noted that there was a significant downturn in business spending in the U.S. So again, this fear about this becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy is very real. And one of the things that we see here at the Conference Board is almost historic differentiation between the levels of consumer confidence, which is still near record highs, and the level of CEO confidence, which is near record lows. So you have this huge spread in the expectation views of consumers who are really keeping the global economy and the U.S. economy out of recession, and CEOs not having all that confidence and starting to pull back on spending. So something has to give on that, right? Either the consumer, the danger here is that the consumers start to lose faith in the economy. It starts to impact jobs, and all of a sudden their confidence levels start to decline and meet these CEO levels, and then you have your recession.
Or the other way, that business confidence goes up again to meet consumer confidence. Actually, I made the same chart for Europe, and it's a bit the same story. Large gap between confidence among consumers and among business leaders. I know it's never easy to talk about these results because we have a lot of numbers and we cannot show them on a slide deck. But what I want to ask you is, do you see concerns differing by region a lot?
I think for the external concerns, there is a coalescence around the notion of recession. It's either one or two, across the board in the regions in the country. So, and the uncertainty around global trade, again, there's kind of a convergence. So those top five that are kind of closely strung together. The concerns, the impact of the external environment is being felt equally in a lot of areas, but China is kind of interesting in that it's a little bit of an outlier. CEOs in China say that they have in their top five the effect of economic sanctions. They're starting to feel these sanctions bite. We have the tech, we have the tariff issue, which is one thing, but it's the tech war, if you will, between the U.S. and China, and the sanctions that on companies like Huawei. CEOs in China are starting to feel that pinch, and I think that's really kind of an interesting notion. And also in China, a little bit of an outlier is that they have in their top five is this notion about their customers are becoming more demanding, and that's a country that has never really been known for the quality of its products or services, and CEOs look like as China moves towards a consumer-driven economy, that they're starting to take notice of the more demanding consumer within China. So I think those are kind of interesting points. And Japan is feeling the labor market tightness more than anyone else, according to our survey. So yeah, those are as I say, there's a coalescence around some of those issues, but there certainly are some interesting outliers, and I think they really do reflect the microclimate within those regions and countries.
Actually, speaking of China, I have a curiosity. I don't think it's something you can actually answer, but I wonder what you think. So very recently, on December 13th, US and China announced that they reached some sort of trade deal. We don't know the details. It's not been published yet as of now, but they reached an agreement. And we circulated the survey in September and October, but I wonder if we were to circulate it now or in January and February, do you think trade uncertainty will still come as high as it is right now?
Oh, I certainly do. I think what we're seeing, what we saw with the U.S.-China phase one, step one of the trade pact is just that. It's a bit of a Band-Aid. Some political motivation behind it. It's not the grand bargain, the sweeping. It's not addressing the key issues really about market access, and a lot of it's going to be in the execution. China's been known for talking a good game, but then not playing a good game, right? So I don't think that China-U.S. pact is enough to move the needle or alleviate concerns around when you look at the whole global trade structure. I mean, there are still issues, even though the U.S. has got a new type of NAFTA agreement. Again, there's going to be winners and losers out of that, and it's just right at this point in time, it's not the grand bargain that people were hoping for. It's a very early stage, and I don't think it's enough to alleviate those fears around trade.
No, you're right. I agree, actually, because even if you look at the WTO as of now, the institution is paralyzed because they don't have enough judges to just deal with the cases. So that's another concern. So I get the point, and I actually agree with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that there just isn't a commitment to multilateralism, certainly by the current administration in the U.S. that would go all the way to letting CEOs get a good sleep when it comes to trade.
Right. So we said what's ranking high. It's number one, recession risk, uncertainty around trade and political instability, tight labor markets, competition. So these are the top five, more or less coming back in all parts of the world. Now, of all of these results, and I know there is much more than these top five, is there something that surprised you one way or the other, negatively or positively?
Yeah, there always are surprises in this survey, and I think this is interesting. That one of the things that we saw a heightened concern around, or more of a prioritization, is around climate change. It's always been almost a bottom feeder for this survey. The impact of climate on businesses has really not registered on the minds of CEOs. But this year we're seeing it move up. And I think that's a good sign. And it's moving up across the board with really one exception, kind of being China, which is interesting. But, we're seeing this recognition, and it goes hand in hand with, I think, a lot of the conversation in the media and social media. The heightened concern in the UN, and also this notion of more. We see from our governance side, our governance practice, that companies are starting to publicly report on their notion of mitigating climate risk and the risks involved. So the reporting numbers, the public disclosure of having a climate change policy and a risk mitigation strategy is really on the rise. So I think those two go hand in hand. And that was a little bit of a surprise for us because, as I say, in previous years, it's always been not so important. And we're starting to see that rise. I think that's a really interesting notion.
Is there any country where it ranks higher than in others? I mean, who are the bad guys and the good guys here?
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. So in Latin America, of all places, it's in the top 5, right? The impact of climate change is 4 in Latin America. As I said, it's 18 in China, there were 19 choices. So that's pretty low. And I think, although it's 12th in the U.S., so it's kind of in the middle of the pack or a little bit below the middle of the pack. But again, that's been a rise. We're seeing that number come up. I think in an ideal world, the way the debate's going in the public arena, we would hope, or the public would hope, that would be higher, that there would be greater recognition of the corporate social responsibility around climate change and environmentally friendly productions. But I would suspect that as this debate continues to intensify, and stakeholders, investors are starting to look at those climate change strategies, and that this would go up, that it's going to become more of an issue. And then you have the notion of regulation, where certainly in some jurisdictions, in some regions of the world, they're mandating that kind of reporting. So I would expect to see that rise as a concern a little bit.
I remember from last year's results, actually, that Japan was the one that placed it highest in 2019. Was a kind of an early bird in this alarm.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's still, again, they have it right around where actually, when I look at those numbers, that it's also quite high in Japan. I think it's 6th in Japan. So, they've perennially and over the last 2 years at least, that notion of climate change has had an impact on Japan. I think, coming out of disasters like Fukushima, and that whole, the country's awareness or sensitivity to climate issues is much greater because they lived through some really awful disasters.
I'm asking you a lot about this because I know from another podcast of the Conference Board that when we look at the consumer confidence data, there is an increasing number of consumers that is placing climate change and global warming as their top one concern. And there are some countries where, I'm going from top of my head, like Germany and France, where this is a higher concern than things that are normally number one, like health or the economy, for example. So I think it's worth going into the details of this, and I recommend reading the report as soon as it comes out.
Yeah, Larry, I think that's a really good point. But I think there's one caveat there, is that I think a lot of what we see is that people don't open their wallets or are particularly willing to pay a high premium for a sustainably produced product. So, again, I think we're maybe in early stages. At least the awareness and recognition is there on behalf of the consumers. And now if we can get them to open their wallets and pay for it, that's the next step. But it's a good start.
Right. Well, at this point in our program, we're going to take a short break for some quick announcements and be back in just a minute to continue discussing the latest insights on the hot buttons.
Looking for additional business insights in this subject area and beyond this podcast? Go to tcb.org/EU and explore our Economy, Strategy and Finance Centre. Uncover a large array of products hosted by the Conference Board in focus areas like global economy, labour markets and many others. Products include peer-to-peer networking events, expert briefings, publications, data and analysis, webcasts, videos and blogs.
Hello again, Chuck, and thank you for taking the time to share the insights from the C-Suite Challenge Survey 2020. I would like to ask you in the second half of the podcast what keeps CEOs awake at night in relation to their own organization, because what we discussed so far was very much related to the external environment, and now I would like to switch to the second question of the survey. So what are the concerns inside the organization?
Yeah, I think that you can almost sum it up in one word, and it's talent. The lack of it, the shortages of the skills, the attraction, retention of top talent. It's number one for CEOs across the globe in every region, with the exception of Japan, where it's number two. But it's about talent. And the other notion, again, is this idea around the disruptive technologies and the need to create new business models. The whole, if you will, digital transformation of the enterprise. It's really a concern, and a lot of organizations are those digital immigrants, not those companies that were born digital, but those that are making that transition. A lot are really struggling to come up with the new business model and the effective go-to-market strategy that the disruptive technologies are forcing them to do, and the notion of competitors. When we go back to the externals, the notion of intensifying competition. So it's coming from everywhere. So it's talent, it's disruptive technology, and then it's culture. The idea of building and creating a more innovative culture, making innovation everyone's responsibility within the organization. That's number 3 on the list of CEOs globally. And in order to get that culture, do that digital transformation, it's about developing the next generation of leaders. And when we ask about that next generation of leaders is really pointed towards leaders who can rally the troops in a time of digital transformation, strong change management skills, transparency of information. So it's a different kind of leader that the organizations are looking for, and that's very high. That's very high on their list. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, what has snuck back up into the top 5 is this notion of cost reduction. So the scary part about the recession risk, well, they're actually taking some action by reducing costs, building the roof before it rains, if you will, right? So those are the main concerns. And again, there's a good coalescence around those top issues, but especially around the talent and the disruptive technologies.
Right, and I have to ask you this question again, because I know we can look at the results by region, we can look at by industry, by company size. Do you see a lot of differences? Because it feels to me that when you look at the external environment, at the end, a company is a company, a multinational is a multinational. Whereas when you look at inside the organization, maybe these differences become more interesting. Is that right?
Yeah, there are. I mean, I think that, as you go further down the list, the priorities do change for certain regions. I think, again, China is a really interesting outlier in this, in that there's a real focus on the notion of compensation alignment and performance management. So they have, in fact, better alignment of compensation and incentives with business strategy. That's the number 2 concern for CEOs in China. So as the economy starts to slow a little bit in China, where that growth, when you opened your door, you automatically grew 10%, right? That has stopped happening, and it's now really more about can we be more efficient, more productive within? And for years, the salary structures in China have been way out of control. Now we're seeing concerns around, getting that alignment of the compensation and the performance and the productivity side. So I think that's a really interesting idea. And there's also, some concern too about a more effective project performance management system. Again, very high in China, and higher. Interestingly, it's in the top 10 in Europe. So the performance management is something I think a lot of organizations struggle with internally, and especially as you go to being organized around agile mobile teams, right? That is how you compensate and reward that work done in teams while still giving the individual a personalized career path is something that organizations are really struggling with. We hear from our members that no one's really got it nailed yet.
So there is a lot of labor market related issues there ranking high, and So wage growth, tight labor markets, talent shortages. It's been there for a few years, if I remember well. So I'm wondering, given that it's been a problem for some time, is there anything companies are experimenting with to find new solutions?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing a lot in among companies that are making that transformation. Take Cisco, for example, which is has transformed itself from basically a manufacturer of technology switches, a hardware firm, to a software-oriented, software solutions firm. Same kind of transition that IBM went through years ago, and I think one of the realizations that comes up about dealing with the tightness of the labor markets is that you can't hire your way out of a digital talent shortage, right? The problem is that when you hire somebody for a specific skill, that skill is probably outdated in about 18 months, right? So what a lot of companies are starting to do, we see Amazon spending hundreds of millions of dollars on evolving their internal existing talent base, and I think really, a grow your own strategy, if you will, right? So I think what we're really seeing is this idea that, hey, the people that we have in place, if we can keep them engaged, if we can keep updating their skill levels, it's going to help us alleviate our skill shortages. We have to grow our own, and I think that's a strong movement we certainly see on this side in the U.S. So and we're seeing it too, I think, to some extent in Asia Pacific, as the quality as companies realize that they need to raise the quality of their labor. So they're putting real resources into this notion of reskilling and upskilling the workforce, and I think that's a sound strategy in a time of tight labor markets.
I think this is, you just mentioned the quote of the day, basically, for me, which is, you cannot hire your way out of labor shortages. I really like that.
No, it's really about evolving your existing talent base, and but doing real effort, real time to evolve it is the way you're going to survive.
Now, leaving the labor market aside, I'm curious to hear again if in this question as well you found something surprising, disappointing.
Yeah, I think one of the issues that we would like to see a much higher prioritization within firms is this notion of equal pay for equal work. It was, again, near the bottom, 16 of 19 globally, near the bottom of the list. Shockingly, I think it was the dead last in the U.S. And dead last in China. That is concerning, especially with all the momentum around around equality in the workplace, equal pay, the demands, some being mandated by government legislation of disclosing pay gaps, public disclosures of pay gaps. And it's not. It's really this notion of implementing equal pay for equal work is very low. Interestingly, it was very high in Latin America, so that was a good thing. And in Europe, it's again below the middle of the pack. It's in the bottom third of the responses. And I think we would like to see some more action being taken to alleviate those gaps. And it will happen, I think, because of the pressure of public disclosure. Investors, other stakeholders, customers, consumers, clients want to do business with a firm that does the right thing, and it's just in a notion of in a very tight labor market, the retention of the female workforce is critical as they develop into more managerial positions, and to not accede to equal pay for equal work is a strategy that's going to cause problems both within the firm and with its customer base.
Did I see it correctly in the data that women C-suite respondents rank this higher than men, actually quite a bit higher?
Yeah, no surprise. In fact, it was when we did the break in genders for C-suite executives, that women executives had it sixth on their list. and that it was 15th on the list for men. So obviously, the sensitivity for the people that this impacts the most, I have it as much more of a concern. And I think it really raises an interesting notion, and I think it encourages the idea that action will be taken, because the women see it as one of their major issues in the workplace, and it needs to be addressed, and the guys need to get on with it to make sure it works.
Or you can solve the problem by promoting more women into the C-suite, and then it will automatically fix itself at some point.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. But it'll come. But again, we're seeing some progress, certainly on the board level. There's more diversification on the board, gender-wise. So, that's a good sign. It's not moving as fast as it should or could. But I think it is this notion of building a pipeline. We need more women in the C-suite, and then when they get into the C-suite, they'll be board ready. So it's going to take time, but you'll get that virtuous cycle going at some point, I hope.
We are getting there, hopefully. I want to give a little teaser into the next podcast that will refer to the second report. So what we just discussed is the results of the first two questions of the survey, so the hot buttons, and then we will have a second report, and the title will be something like Collaborating to Compete. And so maybe, Chuck, if you want to give a little teaser, why is competition ranking so high? And tell us something, an appetizer.
Yeah, one of the assumptions that we make, and also something that we certainly hear from our members, it's almost a steady drumbeat, is that in this day and age, it's impossible to go it alone, to be the lone wolf, if you will, and rely on, say, your own internal R&D department for innovation. You need to break down those external walls and start to collaborate with not only your traditional partners like your vendors and consultants and those sorts of things, but the non-traditional partners, the startups, government agencies, and even if you want to say extreme cases, competitors. So that need for collaboration in order to be innovative and stay ahead of trend on technology is really important, and that's what this next report will be about.
Nice. Well, unfortunately, our time is up for today, and I would like to thank you all for joining us, and big thank you to my guest Chuck for sharing the first insights from the C-Suite Challenge 2020. As I just said, this is not the last conversation with Chuck on the results of the survey, and we will come back soon with a couple of more episodes. One, as we just said, related to how competition is changing and how companies are venturing or not venturing into new partnerships. And we will record another podcast on how business leaders see data privacy and cybersecurity. So I hope you enjoyed our Indication podcast today, and please feel free to subscribe to our channel on platforms like iTunes or Spotify, or if you want to find out more about the subject, please visit our website at tcb.org/C-Suite Challenge. Thanks again, and goodbye.
This has been Indications from the Conference Board.